In this talk, we discuss the important issue of whether there is empirically any correlation between democracy and economic growth. Specifically, we investigate the issue that whether increased democracy has a causal effect on economic growth. The motivation for our paper is that over the past couple of decades, there has been an increasing wave of democratization across the world. In fact, we have also seen that due to the increase of democratization, we have seen an end of colonization in Africa. We've also seen the end of Cold War and communism in Eastern Europe. And we've also seen fewer of the extreme right-wing dictatorships emerge, like they were in the case of Argentina and Chile. In fact, if you look at the data, we can see that over the past 50 years, there has been a significant increase in the number of democratic countries, according to the Polity4 dataset. In 1960, 39% of the countries in the world were democratic. By 2010, that share has gone up to 61%. Now, why are democracies so important? Democracies have a number of social and political advantages on the people that are living in these countries. We see an improvement in voting rights. Democratic countries also see, in general, better human right conditions. They're also better at protecting the right of minorities. And we also see that in democratic countries, there is, in general, a lower gender discrimination. The key question we address in this paper is that do democracies result in higher economic growth? Now, there are several theoretical arguments that could favor a positive democracy growth nexus. The democratic countries have an ability to remove bad governments from power. Then in democratic countries, we also see a predictable transfer of power between regimes that takes place. Democratic countries also see a stronger incentive for income redistribution. And we also see that democratic countries generally experience higher investment in education. There is a strong theoretical literature which also shows that there are some reasons why democracies may actually be counterproductive to economic growth. One big argument is that elected leaders are often influenced or corrupted by special interest groups, and then they play into the lobbying by these groups rather than work for the betterment of the people. Huntington, who kind of pioneered this study of democracies in the world, argued that it is the efficacy of the policymaking process, not necessarily the democratic form of government or the form of government, that results in better outcomes. Then another thing that democracies can suffer from is increased checks and balances, which could often delay the time it takes to make political decisions. Then because governments are trying to get re-elected, they may have a tendency to overspend, especially in years close to election, to kind of portray a more favorable image to the people. Then democracies may also see a higher level of taxation to finance income distribution. And then increased government, which might be more likely in democracies, could also result in efficiency losses. Now, when the theoretical literature is divided as to what way, is there a positive link between democracy and growth, or is there a negative link between democracy and growth, we can look at the empirical literature to see what the evidence seems to bear out. Unfortunately, The empirical studies on this issue are also divided. There are a group of studies that find that democracy has a negative effect on economic growth. Notable among them are Landau and Barrow 1996. On the other hand, there are some studies which actually find a positive impact of democracy and growth. Gallup, Sachs, and Mellinger, in an important study, find that more democratic regimes experience higher rates of economic growth. Then there are also a set of studies which say that this impact is more nuanced. In fact, they find no perceptible impact of democracy on economic growth. Again, another study by Barrow and Lee find that democratic regimes don't necessarily augur to faster economic growth. Then Roderick and Waxiark, in an important study, find that it is the timing of democracies and economic reforms which result in higher economic growth, not necessarily democratization per se. Then there are also a collection of more recent panel data studies. Panel data studies are longitudinal in nature. They look at time series as well as cross-sectional data set. These new studies do find some positive effect of democracy. Prominent of them are a study by Acemoglu et al., which look at more than 100 countries over 40 years and looking at annual data do find a positive impact of democracy on economic growth. Then more recently, Grunder and Krieger come up with a new measure of democracy and show that using their measure that they come up with, there's a positive link between democracy and economic growth. So where does our study fit in? We contribute to this democracy growth nexus literature from two vantage points. The first is the more technical issue of estimation. The approach that we undertake is dynamic panel data estimation. In dynamic models, we let past levels of the dependent variable have an effect on current values of the dependent variable. So we're allowing for time dependencies in our model. And this was the approach taken by Acemoglu and then Grunder and Krieger in their paper. Both these papers also are fitting in the dynamic panel data literature. The second contribution that we make is that we integrate the deep determinant strand of literature in economic development with the effect of democracy on economic growth. There are three factors that economists have identified as really causing, at a very fundamental level, countries' economic development. And these three factors are institutions, legal institutions, contract enforcement, etc., the openness of the country to the global trading environment, and geography. In our paper, in the study of democracy and economic growth, we incorporate the second strand of literature into our investigation. And then the other contribution that we make is that we use a systems type GMM approach. Typically in dynamic panel data, we cannot find the effect of time invariant variables on the dependent variable. Time invariant variables are variables that don't change with time, for example, geography. In the systems GMM approach, we are able to, in fact, estimate the effect of these time invariant variables on the dependent variable. And then the fourth contribution we make to the literature is that there was a recent paper by Bazzi and Clemens which argued that in a lot of dynamic panel data models, if certain assumptions are not met, then the conclusions could actually be incorrect. So even though there are no formal tests for those assumptions, they suggest some ad hoc or heuristic tests that economists should investigate or to carry out in their study. And we undertake some of those tests to make sure that our model kind of passes those some initial conditions that are necessary to make appropriate conclusions from a dynamic panel data study. So just to give you a snapshot of our results, in our baseline specification, we do find that democracy by itself in explaining economic growth does not play a statistically significant role. On the other hand, some of the deeper determinants of economic growth, specifically institutions, trade, and geography, have a much stronger, both in terms of quantitative impact and in terms of statistically significant, a greater impact on economic growth. And the other variable that we find that contributes to positive economic growth is the stability of the regime. We investigate this study using a variety of democracy measures, and no matter what democracy measure we look at, we find that the conclusions do not change. And then finally, in the last step, we also bring in some macroeconomic policy variables into our study. And we find that these macroeconomic policy variables also have an impact on economic growth. So instead of democracy, there's some of these other variables per se that are contributing to economic growth. Let us look at our estimating equation. The model that we estimate is as a dependent variable, including growth rate of a country I at time t, and that is explained as a function of time varying variables like institutions, trade, democracy, captured by the set of variables in xit, time invariant variables like geography, which don't change over time, captured by the set xt, and past levels of economic development, captured by yi t minus 1. Rearranging our equation gives us the final model, and that's the model that we estimate. So in our estimating equation, we are studying the effect on past GDP per capita as a measure of economic development, trade, geography, institutions, democracy on current levels of GDP per capita. There are some issues, though, that we have to confront in dealing with our model. One big issue is that of endogeneity. In other words, does our y get affected by x, or y in fact affect x? For example, some countries may experience high levels of economic growth because they have better political institutions. On the other hand, having high levels of economic growth implies more prosperity, which can in turn give the country an ability to implement better political institutions. So does the link flow from better institutions to high growth, or high growth to better institutions? In other words, in the context of democracy, does better democracy imply high economic growth, or high economic growth imply more democratic societies? So in order to untangle this two-way effect, economists use a method called instrumental variables. Instrumental variables are some proxy variables which follow three conditions. The first condition for a variable z to be as a valid instrument is that z should not affect our dependent variable. What that means is that z should not belong in the estimating equation. The second condition is that z should not be correlated with the unobserved error. Otherwise, it will be its effect will be a little corrupted when we estimate it. And thirdly, the variable z should be correlated with x. So when we can proxy z with x, z is capturing the effect of x, but it's itself not contaminated by the error and not also affected by our dependent variable. Now, how do we find these instrumental variable z's? There are two approaches in the literature which help address this issue. The first approach finds external variables that don't belong in the model but will meet the role of instruments. These external instruments, to be valid, should not be a part of the original equation, and that's where the challenge would come in. For example, some countries might use the origin of a country's legal system as an instrument. However, the problem with this variable is that this variable can proxy not just institutional quality, it can proxy democracy, it can proxy some other variables. So what variable is it trying to instrument? And then the other challenge is that it is almost impossible, especially in the study of economic growth, to find variables that will truly not belong in the model. There will be some specification in which that instrument that we are considering would be a part of the main equation, and then that makes it an invalid instrument. The second approach in this literature is to take the past values of our endogenous variables to proxy for current values. Now, the past values fit the exclusion restrictions quite well because the past values could affect today's values, but are not affected by today's values because they already happened in the past. But then the second problem that you might confront is, are these past values a good proxy for this period's values? Now, there are tests that we carry out which will be checking for these restrictions in our model. Then another implementational or practical problem with these external instruments is that variables like a country's legal origin or mortality of settlers, which has been used in the past, are time invariant. So it is hard to use these time invariant values to proxy for variables which are more contemporaneous and which change with time. And then on the technical side, the other thing that we do is that we estimate our model using 5-year averages, because these 5-year averages tend to smoothen out business cycle fluctuations, because we're trying to say the effect of democracy and other variables on economic growth, which can fluctuate widely on a year-to-year basis. So taking a 5-year average tempers some of that fluctuation. Let us briefly look at our dataset and the variables we use in our study. We have data for more than 150 countries over a 50-year span. Not all of these countries will appear in all our specifications. Our sample size ranges from 95 to 140, depending on the data availability. Our dependent variable is GDP per capita in constant PPP dollars, or real GDP per capita. This variable ignores or cleans out the effect of inflation, which can artificially increase the value of GDP. For democracy, we use a variety of variables used in literature. Some of our variables are single variables from various sources, and we also use index variables, which tend to compile data from a variety of democracy variables. Two of the more common variables used in literature are the Freedom House Index Democracy Score, which is a collection of political liberties and civil rights scores across different countries, and the P for Democracy, which is from the Polity4 dataset. There is another recent measure of democracy introduced by Grunder and Krieger in their recent paper called Support Vector Machine Democracy Index. The authors claim that this variable captures democracy from a variety of variables and synthesizes the information from those into one index. We use that variable also in our study. For institutions, our main variable is contract-intensive money. This is the ratio of money in the financial system to the broad money. The logic behind this measure is that if citizens feel that their country's monetary institutions are upright and they'll enforce contracts, they will get their money back, they're more comfortable putting money in those formal banking systems. If, on the other hand, citizens are afraid of their money being given back to them, or if they're afraid that the contracts will not be enforced, they will hold their money in non-monetary assets, like either as cash or even as bullion or something, but they will not put the money in the formal banking system. So the ratio of money in the formal banking system to total money supply in some ways captures the trust that people have in a country's institutional system. For instability of regime, we measure that by a variable that captures the extent of turnover that takes place in any one given year among a government's key decision makers. Then we also have a variety of measures that capture countries' openness to trade. For geography, we use distance from the equator and also a measure which captures the disease environment called malaria ecology. Then for government policy, we use three different measures. Black market premium, which again shows the government's control of the trading system, and more importantly, inflation rate and the size of government in GDP, captured by government's consumption expenditure. Let's now turn our attention to our findings. So again, our specification in all these models is to study the effect on GDP or economic growth of a bunch of or independent variables. So in our basic specification, we are looking at the impact on GDP of the past level of GDP, institutional quality captured by contract-intensive money, democracy, a couple of trade measures, and geography. So the first result that we see is that past income levels affect today's income level. So there's a lot of persistence in economic growth. We also find that contract-intensive money, or a measure of institutional quality, has a statistically significant impact on economic growth. So the stars in our specification denote significance levels. 3 stars indicate significant at 1% level, 2 stars indicate significance at 5% level, and 1 star indicates significance at 10% level. So we see that institutions across the board enter in a highly significant way. Interestingly, we find that the most commonly used measure of democracy, the P for democracy measure, has no significant impact on economic growth. It is not statistically significant. In fact, the magnitude is negative, but could be 0 as well. Then we also see that trade has a positive impact, and the further away a country is from the equator, it has higher economic growth. We also see that higher the incidence of disease captured by the malaria ecology measure, lower is the economic growth. So in this basic specification, we see that economic growth is positively affected by institutional quality, by trade or openness to trade, and by geography measures, but not so much by democracy measures. We then check our results with robustness checks, in which we are running alternative models to see what impact was our result sensitive to just one particular usage, or our results are true across different specifications. So in this, we use a different measure of institutional quality captured by the veto players. So this is a number of decision makers in a government, because the idea is that they will have checks and balances. So if you have more veto players, there is better institutional quality. And we find that veto players, or institutions measured by veto players, do have a positive impact on economic growth. So we see that the coefficients are positive, and they're all highly statistically significant. We also see that democracy has no impact on economic growth again. We also see that even the support vector machine learning, or the latest measure of democracy, which is an index of various measures, also enters our specification without any statistical significance. On the other hand, we see that trade share, or trade, has a positive impact on economic growth. We also see in the last column that instability of regime, or if there's fairly quick turnover among decision makers in the government, that actually has a negative impact on economic growth. So stability of regime is critical for economic growth. On the other hand, if the regime is unstable, there's instability, then we have a negative economic growth. In this model, we now expand our analysis to incorporate the 2 policy variables we discussed before. Specifically, we have inflation rate, and we also have the size of the government as captured by the share of government spending in GDP. Again, the results are consistent across the various specifications. We find that institutions again play a positive role. All our institutional variables are statistically significant with the right sign. We also see that trade share or openness to trade has a positive impact on economic growth. And then the third deep determinant, captured by geography, also enters with the right sign and is statistically significant. What we find is that in each column, the role of geography or distance from the equator is positive. Further away a country is from the equator, it tends to have higher economic growth. Like before, democracy enters our model without any statistical significance. So again, we established that democracy does not have any perceptible impact on economic growth. It was the other variables that we discussed. Now looking at policy, in each specification, as we read from each column, in all these models, we see that inflation rate has a negative impact on economic growth. So a country experiencing high inflation has a lower economic growth. And often inflation is also corroborated by increased government borrowing, spending more money, which might be a result of increased government consumption. And we see that in our results as well. Increased government consumption is also associated with a negative economic growth. So to conclude, what we find is that if you look down each specification across each column, institutions, trade, and geography all impact economic growth in a statistically significant way. So do policy variables. Countries experiencing high inflation levels and high levels of government spending as a share of GDP seem to have lower economic growth. On the other hand, we cannot say the same for democracy. Democracy seems to have no perceptible effect on economic growth as such. So just to recap our conclusions, what we find is that there is a strong, robust evidence that democracy measures, we have looked at a variety of measures, none of them has a statistically significant impact on economic growth. On the other hand, institutional quality, openness to trade, political stability, and geography matter for growth. And so do macroeconomic policy variables. So what is the bottom line? Using a variety of model specifications, using a large data set across more than 100 countries spanning 40 years, and using dynamic panel data methods and checking for assumptions and validity of our methods, what we say is that as far as economic growth is concerned, a regime that can provide its people with better law and order, better institutional quality, where contracts get enforced, where there are effective public institutions, where there is a stable or predictable political regime without frequent turnover of key decision makers, a regime where the government size, as measured by government spending to GDP ratio, is smaller, a country which has sounder macroeconomic fundamentals like a stable inflation, which is more open to global linkages and trade, does experience higher economic growth. So what we are not saying is that democracy is bad as such. We've seen studies, we have talked about the fact that democracy does bring in several desirable features. Democratic regimes generally have higher levels of human capital, human development, human rights, better gender rights, gender equity, higher investments in education, there's more freedom. But as far as economic growth is concerned, it is the things that we highlight here that matter more than the type of regime. For future work, I think we will investigate the inquiry where we'll see what channels are there through which democracy might affect economic growth. There's no direct effect of democracy on growth, but democracy does affect a bunch of things that we have talked about, which in turn affect economic growth. So developing a theory around the channels through which democracy interacts with growth would be a fruitful line of inquiry that we'll undertake next. Thank you.